Yo creo que llegamos en un momento donde Colombia salía de una época muy oscura de su historia y casi sin saberlo pudimos generar un espacio de conversación colectiva, que es lo que hizo que el festival tuviera tanto éxito.
Ese festival nos permitió entrar en conversación a los escritores, y eso es un fenómeno maravilloso.
No me imaginé que llegaríamos a los 20 años, debo confesar.
Me trajo la oportunidad de hablar de mí misma y de toda la comunidad LGBTIQ+, con otras palabras.
Si el Hey Festival no hubiera existido durante estos 20 años, muchos de nosotros seríamos muy distintos, nos ha enriquecido de la mejor manera posible.
Cuando nos desafinamos, no escuchamos bien las armonías y no podemos escuchar al otro, que es lo peor. Estos festivales son muy importantes porque podemos escuchar al otro.
It's the jewel in the crown of the Hay Festival in terms of its international presence.
And that's what we do. We tell stories and we try and bring the world together.
Bueno, ya por se lo ponen en el 1, aquí está en el 1.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to see such a packed theater to discuss literature. Can you hear us? How about now? This is an original talk because this is a celebration of the 20th edition of the Hay Festival in Cartagena. And it had to do with asking Colombians what might be the most important questions to ask ourselves, ranging from a variety of topics. Today's topic has to do with culture. The questions are many and they're varied, but what I have strived to do, and I hope to have interpreted these questions that you've asked correctly, in this broad topic, which is culture, in a social conversation such as today's, I've made an effort to translate these questions into the work of authorship of each of our panelists today. To provide examples for the questions raised in this list of questions, I'd like to share a story with you. In 1967, at the National University of Engineering in Lima, Peru, for the first time, a conversation was held publicly between Gabo and Mario Vargas Llosa. Gabo had just hailed from Buenos Aires, and he had seen and confirmed the incredible success of 100 Years of Solitude, and he said that this had to do with a reader's boom, that Latin Americans were finally reading Latin American authors. And Llosa had just collected a great prize and had given an unforgettable speech on the importance of writing that goes by the name Literature is Fire. And Vargas Llosa interviewed Gabriel Garcia Marquez and opened up the dialogue the following way. He said he felt people were not asking themselves what the point was for the existence of an engineer architect, but sometimes they would wonder why the work of a writer. So he began this conversation by asking Gabriel Garcia Marquez, "What good are you as a writer?" And Gabo said, "Well, when I realized I was no good at anything, I became a writer." And then he said this famous quote saying, "The truth is that I write for my friends to love me more." And he concluded by saying that when he reads other great pieces of literature, he realizes that literature has a role of subversion, that there is no literature that doesn't actually have founded beliefs put on the upside down. So most of the questions with regard to culture have to do with just that, how we can change things around and create a new reality. I believe the four panelists here do just that in their work. So I would like for us to discover, and I'd like to begin with you, Cristina Rivera Garza, Mexican writer. In your literature, I believe that starting with your first novel, No Me Verás Llorar, up until the last one, El Invencible Verano de Liliana, there is a constant question present, and it has to do with memory. In your case, you are a historian, and you work on memory from a very interesting perspective, which is the archive, and how the archive is like a living being, although it might seem fixed, but it's alive. And this is a way to reconfigure a story or a tale. From this dimension of literature that you've approached things from as well, what role does memory or building of memory have? Thank you very much, and what a pleasure to be here. It's such a great pleasure to see you in this fantastic place. It's the first time that I've set foot in this theater, so I'm still taking it all in, impressed and just enjoying all the images I'm seeing. How are you all doing? Oh, that's great. I love to see that you're here filled with energy. I am delighted to be here with all of you. Well, I've always thought that literature is a critical exercise. It allows me to carefully observe my environment and find areas where there might be fissures through which we can see a different present and, if we're lucky, a different future as well. I believe literature is also investigation. I don't think literature is something that cannot be unexplainable, that comes out of nowhere, and it's just taking us all by surprise. I believe there's a lot of work involved, and everyone does different types of work. I've found that there is a beauty to working with archive precisely because of what you've said, Pilar, because it has to do with memory. We live in very unequal societies, and we don't all have the same right to memory. There are entire swaths of our population where it's difficult to even know that they exist, names that are forgotten, and above all, in poor areas, women and bodies that have not been normalized, or racial groups that have not been recognized as different races, gender, etc. I believe it has to do with these cruel divisions that define the structure for our society, and it's here that I believe literature plays a key role. Part of the work that I do is to question and ask the official narratives of those in power that tell us that the way things are is the way it is and will always be. I like to subvert things. I think these fissures are ones that we can open up when we awaken language, because that's another great power that literature holds, awakening a language that can play a key role in our day-to-day lives. So it's about asking these questions of those whose memory has not yet formed part of our everyday conversations. This is why resorting to the archive is so important to me. The archive can be a place of power because every nation state has an archive, but it's also true that we can live the archive in various ways, and we can uncover the voices of many of these communities and groups I mentioned earlier. In Nadie me verá llorar, I investigated documents from a madhouse or a mental hospital. And there I was reading some medical files, especially the medical files of women in this insane asylum, that speaks of the limitations applied to the woman's body. But there we also find the letters and the drawings and the experience that are constantly challenging these limitations. I am very interested in this challenge and this friction. I'm interested in the archive not just to go back in time, but also to explore matters of the present. I'm not going into the past as a nostalgic act to see what things were like in the past, but it's quite the contrary, to give new vigor to these forces that have been erased by those in power and that we can bring to our everyday lives through the use of words and writing. And in that regard, I believe the literary exercise is one that is vital. And as Garcia Marquez said, it can create new realities, lives, and thus it can create reality. And you do it so well. I'd like to personally say, in El Invencible Verano de Liliano and Los Archivos de tu Hermana Asesinada. So apart from this reflection, you do this individually as well. Could you tell me a little bit about this? It's great that you mentioned that because I forgot to do so myself. I have been researching institutional archives looking for a personal and unique story, a story that we might never find elsewhere. But over the years, I have also been working with a different kind of archive that I now call the archive of those of affection, which are the footprints of people beyond the state, not as subjects of the state, but part of a community of those that we hold affection for. And in the Invencible Verano de Liliana, the reason why I was able to write this very personal book about the feminicide that my sister was a victim of prior to this word actually existing, was having access to very personal documents, very intimate documents. And what remains there is a version of the world that we oftentimes don't hear of. And the patriarchal narrative is oftentimes hiding this from us, especially in cases of violence, in this case, femicide. Patriarchy describes femicide as a crime of passion that oftentimes blames victims and pardons those responsible for this crime. And having these documents uncovers a much more complex world. And in the book, it was important for me to express how my sister or any other victim of femicide is not reduced to the event of death, but also an opportunity to explore a very rich, complex, full life. And this is what will make it possible for us to all miss her and to miss all of the others. So there's a political aspect here, a small everyday revolution when we agree to miss someone collectively. And by missing that someone, we bring her into our conversations and life. And this is something that literature can also offer. This allows me to ask a question to Nicola, an Italian writer that has authored many books, but I would like to focus on one more specifically. The City of the Living, La Ciudad de los Vivos, a non-fiction novel. I'd like to provide you with some context if you haven't read it. 1st of March, 2 men, after a wild night, kill another person using knives and hammers. Nicola becomes obsessed with this event, but I believe he does something fabulous, and I would like to ask him to tell us more about this and the way literature can shed light as well. Because he's not asking how it happened or where it happened, but rather, why did it happen? And this is a question that requires that we suspend moral judgment, because it's setting aside the horror of it all and investigating something. Why two relatively normal people would do something like this. This is something that literature offers and that contributes to this debate when we ask what is the role of writers. I'd like to ask that you please tell us more about this inquiry.
Okay, I will try. Good morning. Thank you to be here. I'm very happy to be with you, and I ask sorry for my bad English. So I will try with my dirty and broken English. Yes, I remember very well the day that on the TV I saw the news about this terrible murder. That it was in Rome and not so far from my house. With the motorbike, it will be 10 minutes. I was shocked for the violence of the killing, because this boy, Luca Varani, his age was 23, was killed by 100 hit by knife and hammer by two 30-year-old boys. There was no reason for this marriage. No money, no revenge, nothing at all. One of the two murderers, or one of the two killers, didn't know the victim before seeing him. The other things that moved me, it was that the two killers were considered totally normal people. Okay, this word is very hard. Normal. Who is normal? Maybe no one is normal. But they were not criminal boys. They from the day of the killing, they never been involved in violent situation. But the most incredible thing to me was that the two killers, they know, of course, they killed a boy, but it was as the news, the information did not become consciousness in themselves. They act like they did not have free will killing this boy, but of course they had free will, and they picture themselves, the killers, not as guilty but as victim of circumstances, victim one of the other. He manipulated me, and vice versa, and it was a very new thing to me. They were totally different, for example, from the Raskolnikov of Crime and Punishment, because he was very aware of what he did, and he was able to take on himself the responsibility. They were totally not able to do it. And so I began to make an investigation. And I understand what literature forever teaches us, and we are stupid when we think that we have an answer for everything. But wisdom of literature is to have a question for everything, not an answer. And to hear is more important than to tell. Okay, you tell, you write, but after you hear and after you try to understand. And also, literature, I think, is not a trial. To understand is more important than to judge. And that's why literature is totally different from what is happening in a normal conversation of the think about the social media. On social media, all of us want to judge each other every time, every second. In literature, it's more important to understand. In this case, of course, the guilty and the innocent were very, very clear. It was very clear what happened, who were the killers, and who was the victim, etc. But the lesson of and another thing that I think about why I made this investigation, that at the beginning was very difficult, because it was very difficult to having the phone number to phone to the parents of the victim, to the parents of the killers. I was very very shy and very fear. I had fear, but they wanted to talk, and talk maybe is a way to as a therapy. And it reminds me that literature don't start with writing, but with talking. Nasce orale, c'è l'oralità, no? Before, and that was il mio tentativo, my try to tell about this terrible crime. And I felt, last thing, these three boys, as I feel, I don't know why, very close to them, as there was three younger brothers in a big troubles. Of course, different, because two are guilty and one not. But I feel very close to them. I don't know deeply why. Maybe I wrote this book to understand it.
Piedad, hay otro elemento central.
There is another key role for literature and writing that has to do with language. As Cristina said earlier, you're a narrator and a poet. And in fact, you've done something very concrete. You have written a formidable book on a terrible experience, such as what it means to lose a child, which is giving words to that which is difficult to even mention, something that you can never even describe. When a father or a mother loses their child, there is no way to even describe this. Language is not only something of this time, but it's something that is manipulated, and it can be registered in one way or another. Sometimes it's language that's thinking for itself when you name things that have been established in reality. My question is whether or not you feel that literature and writers play a role in liberating language in this way, leaving it free, absolutely free. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Pilar. Nicola was saying that literature begins before you begin to write, correct? And this idea of literature taking over us, and that we become captives to this idea, whether it be to write a novel or to write a poem or a series of poems. But the immediate question that comes to us is, how can language be used to serve this purpose? And the key role a writer has when the time comes to write doesn't have so much to do with what they're going to say as it does with how I'm going to say it or tell the story. And in that regard, language plays a central role. And I'm going to speak of what happens specifically in the world of poetry, because of course novels must look for precision, concision, beauty, intensity, etc. But it's in poetry where we truly subvert the order of language. And that allows us to renew a language. So, mid-19th century, what the French poets did was to incorporate everyday language into poetry, which is what many people that are afraid of poetry has not been able to understand. There's still sometimes a mistaken idea of poetry, where supposedly poetry should use the most sophisticated words available, but it's not the case. I believe poets, when writing, are working with the musicality of their own language, because we're no longer thinking about the number of syllables and things like this, but rather looking to discover the musicality in our own language. And when writing novels, we're also working with rhythms. Garcia Marquez does this wonderfully. When you read 100 Years of Solitude, you see that these are truly poems that are using the musicality of language, but it's closely linked, this musicality and rhythm, to the meaning of words. So what a writer is looking for is the exact and right term. And this requires concentration. As a poet that is writing novels and that has written many books of prose, speaks with the mind of a poet. So until I feel like that sentence is powerful, precise, I do not continue and advance. But to respond to the question, to answer Pilar's question, what happens with our everyday language is that it can tire. Sometimes it can become mechanical. I believe functional languages tire the opportunities for richness in words. What readers are granted is a word that once again explores all possible opportunities for that word or possible meanings and sides to that word. They open up incredibly when reading it. So what literature does is working to combat everyday languages bore. Although the other thing that the language of a writer can do is to truly represent the wonders of everyday language and its creativity and its uses. So writers do these two things. So we allow language's full spectrum of possibilities. And we are looking back at the tradition that that word has and its history, but we're also infusing it with everything that it has when it's living in our everyday language. This is why we say that language is at the core of what a writer does. I love that you use this word tradition, because I would like to ask Charla. Charla is a writer and a journalist, and she has visited the classics. Her books discuss just that. In a world where we are increasingly admin, we think things are happening for the first time today. We repeat as never before, perhaps too much. I'd like to ask you, why is it important to read the classics?
Waiting for Luce in the translation, interpreting booth to finish. Thank you so much for the interpretation, and thank you. It's great to be here. Yes, as Pilar said, I work in journalism, but I also write about classical literature. So I have two parts of my life, one of which is thinking about what happened today and yesterday, and the other thing is thinking about what happened 2,000 years ago. And I suppose what I get from thinking about and thinking with the classical world, I think to boil it down, I think that the sort of interesting and important thing is that this world, inescapably, of the classical world, is somewhat familiar to us, to many of us all around the world. I don't think this belongs purely in the West. The tentacles of the classical world have spread via all kinds of routes, via colonialism, but via other routes, so that they do form, in many parts of the world, part of the inheritance, our sort of cultural past and our cultural inheritance. So that gives this world a sort of familiarity. Like we can pick up a piece of ancient literature and we can feel that we are the same people as those people. If you read a poem by Catullus and feel the desire, the emotion, the sense of betrayal, the loss that he writes about in relation to his poems, his love poems to his lover, you can feel an immediate sort of sense of, I understand this, we are the same, you know, we are humans and we connect across this sort of extraordinary gulf of 2,000 years. But at the same time, this world is also incredibly unfamiliar, it's incredibly alien. It's constructed in ways that we certainly wouldn't want to construct a world for ourselves today. It's constructed on slavery, it's constructed on kind of very severely patriarchal grounds, it's constructed on the oppression of women. I mean, you know, there are just innumerable ways in which this world is very different, cosmologically, religiously. And so for me, it's the tension between this sameness, or this familiarity, and this alien nature of the classical world that gives us a place in which we can think. I think, for example, I think that reading Greek tragedy, for instance now, or watching a Greek play on the stage can, because it's not our world, because it has a certain distance from us, we can think about things that are actually very close to us and very, very, very difficult to think about if we think about them too close to us, if you see what I mean. I mean, when you think about the ways that Greek tragedy deal with the fallout of war, with the collateral damage visited upon women and children in war, these are very difficult subjects to think about in our own immediate context sometimes. But thinking about them via these extraordinary works of literature can actually make that work easier and extraordinarily productive, I think.
The four writers present here today also play a public role in various aspects that I would also like us to discuss, because I believe this also sheds light on this question of why fiction and what role a writer has. Cristina. Additional to be a writer, you are also an academic, and you are very much involved in the academic sector of the United States, where they are debating what role literature should play, what role culture should play when it comes to gender and diversity. I would like to ask you how you view this debate and where you position yourself there, both as a professor as well as a writer. What a fantastic question. We're beginning what looks to be a difficult year, one with many challenges, and I believe we need to position ourselves firmly in various areas and realms. I have been living in the United States for many years now, working in the academic sector, and as of 7 years back, I teach a PhD of creative writing in Spanish, the first of its kind in the United States. This is something I believe is very close to literature because we're training new writers. But I believe it's also part of my activism and having an influence in the United States. As you know, although there is a great deal of diversity and the Hispanic community has contributed significantly to the United States, Spanish is still seen as a second-class language. And some controversial things on this matter have been said by a director recently. I believe language is a working language, and that's something that, of course, we are proud of, but it's also a language for reflection, creation, and beauty, all of the above. And I believe my work in this PhD has to do with just that. It has to do with recognizing the importance of a language in the context of the United States. And it's not just about the language, but also about those who speak that language and the cultural, material, physical, economic, and spiritual contribution to the country. We began this PhD in 2017. You might recall what happened in 2017. What's again happening this year? It was precisely in that year that the White House decided to erase Spanish from its website. And it's precisely that year that we said, you can be a Spanish-speaking writer working and writing in the United States, and it's something that we have made happen. So this is a key position for what I do and what I am as a writer, but also as a person. And part of the debates underway and that we see the temperature rising in around this time has to do with this attack to some things that are key to critical thought. These have to do with the autonomy of our bodies, gender equality, considering multiple genders in our everyday lives, and multiple ways to inhabit our bodies, our ability to imagine. I believe one of the attacks that are underway in the United States is that more and more attention will be given in public education. Or for example, in Texas, it's forbidden to speak of slavery because they believe it's too divisive a topic, as they say. And there's a series of limitations to freedom of expression that are being put in place that are also freedom to imagine that is under attack. So it will be increasingly important to have a clear stance. And it will also be important to establish networks of solidarity, to understand that we're not doing this alone, but rather that we are part of broader communities. The great story and heritage of Spanish in the United States, its ability to reflect and to fight, and also this tradition of critical thought and of radical freedom in imagination, without which we would not be able to writing books and without which we really couldn't live a full life out in the streets with our friends and with our families, right? I am deeply concerned. Right before coming to Cartagena, I was speaking to my family and I was wondering if I will now have to take my passport with me wherever I go, because these raids and deportation do not respect anything. All they look at is the way you look, and I clearly am part of the Latin American, Hispanic, Mexican community in the United States. And the desire to not go through this. So I also ask myself, do I want to live a life like this? So this is worth noting. But there's another desire that's also worth noting, and it's that it's also my country. And there has been a fight to be there, and it's important to mention something that was discussed one day back by Javier Zamora and Viet. They said that it's important to also be dissident, to be a dissenter, and to discuss these important topics that have to do with writing and language, but also what we do with our public language and how we are going to be putting together groups of solidarity in times of emergency. Nicola, apart from being a writer, you have been running the Turin International Book Fair. The public conversation on the topic of books when curating a festival or a fair, as you mentioned, in 2017, 2023. Tell me about its transformation. How can a fair become a broadcaster of public conversations and help us to elevate that public debate? Tell us about your experience as the director of the Turin International Book Fair.
I did it for 7 years, were 7 years, very beautiful years, but then I quit because it was not easy. Of course, writing, you write a book when alone, you read a book alone, but around books can grow communities, can rebuild communities, can grow stronger communities, and the Turin Book Fair, it is a book fair. So the difference with the festival is that there are all the publishing houses, and I was lucky because they asked me to make the director of the book fair while the book fair was in a deep crisis. And when such a big institution is in big crisis, you can do everything. You are very, very free to do because you start as a loser, and then all is possible. And it was very beautiful because at the Turin Book Fair arrives every year over 200,000 people. And okay, there are strong readers there, but there are also, and in my opinion are more important, people that did not read a book per year, or they read a book per year, and at the Turin Book Fair, they get a book. They discover authors that we love for a lifetime, but for them are totally unknown. Arrive at schools, and so the students can see how a publishing house work. I love publishing houses because in publishing houses there are a lot of competenze, and I grew up in little publishing houses, and I remember when I was a young boy, and so for me it was very important to save the Turin Book Fair because I had my first job there. At the Turin Book Fair years ago, because I was a degree from a few months. My dream was to work in the publishing houses, and I arrived there and I asked work to all the. There are 1,000 publishing house there. And so I asked, and I asked one publishing house in Rome that make work me. But it became more difficult in Turin Book Fair while it reborn. Why when it become bigger and bigger and bigger? Because you when you rule this role, when you run this role, you don't have to manage only with publishing house and writers. It is but you have to manage with politicians, with the mayor of Turin, with the minister of public instruction, with the minister of culture, and they really did not know what is literature, they really don't know. They really totally don't know. I remember my worst meeting in the Turin Book Fair was a meeting with the Minister of Culture and of. You have to teach them. This is a book. You have to read from left to right, from up to down, and it was very. And the problem, the other problem was that, for example, the mayor of Turin, the culture, the minister of culture, the president of Piedmont region, they were from totally different party, and so you have to be very diplomatic. I began to be. I was not diplomatic before. I was born in 1973. When I was a young boy, exploded punk music all over the world. So my background is not so diplomatic. But during those 7 years at Turin Book Fair, it changed me. I saw another side of how things happen. It was very instructive to me. But then I quit after the experience. It was a very beautiful experience. But my heart is on people that arrive at Turin Book Fair without reading any book the previous years and exit with 2, 3, 4 books. And it is important to work on them.
Buenísimo. Piedad, tú además de ser poeta, narradora.
Piedad, you are a poet, narrator, and also an op-ed writer. I would like to explore one dimension of writing. In the past, they've spoken relating a writer with an intellectual is very common, but today there are many writers that don't necessarily feel that they must engage in public debate. Therefore, they don't necessarily feel related to the role of an intellectual. However, having an opinion or stance is not only a matter for the intellectuals, because nowadays everyone opines about society and politics, etc. I'm wondering what your relationship might be with that role that you have. I'm going to begin by saying that I always wanted to be, or I always said I was a potential op-ed writer. But in practice, I was always writing letters, just like those readers that become columnists that are not recognized. The woman that's always sending letters to the newspaper and these are published. Well, that was me for many years, writing imaginary letters. Because I've always been interested in social and political matters. Until I was fortunate enough to be called to become columnist for El Espectador. I would like to say that this is something that I greatly enjoy doing. Those who read these articles have no idea how much a columnist must write to be able to publish an opinion piece per week on Sundays, which is especially a day that people read a great deal. I'll write a little bit more about these opinion pieces to then answer your question more specifically. In general, writers are looking at life around them. It's not that they're walking around with a notebook in hand, and while they're at the funeral, they're writing notes. No, that's not the case. But nearly. When we are observing the world, then you take note or you write down all of these things. I have my notebooks, and these notebooks speak to you, and many things are born from there. But as a columnist, in a way, it helps me have a broader gaze, because writers are always very focused on their own personal obsessions. However, a journalist or those who write opinion pieces need to open up their perspective to things that are occurring at the very specific point in time and take a stance or develop an opinion on things. So I believe it's a very important path toward knowledge. And there's another thing I'd like to add here, and it's that when writing an opinion piece, I am personally interested on ensuring that I have very solid arguments. And, in second place, to ensure that the language used is for those people that Nicola mentioned that are not often reading books but are interested in the world that surrounds us and current events. So this word, intellectual, is a word that has lost a great deal of respect. It has been discredited. In a way, this word, intellectuals, used to be one of great prestige, and in a way this began to crumble, the idea of being an intellectual. However, I believe I am one of the few writers who believe it's a very legitimate, respectable word, and that writers should, above all, be intellectuals. An intellectual is not only someone that is very educated and informed, that has read a great deal, but also someone that is politically engaged in the world they inhabit, as Cristina expressed. For example, I recently wrote a book that might seem like an autobiography, but it's more of a political act when I write this, because that which is intimate is also public, because it is based on the intimate that we also build our societies. So speaking of the assassination of a sister, a femicide that matters to the whole of society. So literature can do just that. By speaking of very specific things, we can speak or refer or mention more general things. Although it's not an obvious intellectual language that is used necessarily, we are nonetheless carrying out an underground intellectual work, which is of great importance. For example, the work that I wrote about Daniel's suicide, speaking of suicide in societies that have completely silenced and stigmatized suicide and those who commit suicide. And we have religious tradition that has also worked to hide and stigmatize it. Writing about it is a political act. So it's in that way that as writers we can refer to ourselves as intellectuals without necessarily having to write long diatribes of a political nature necessarily. So I personally believe that the word intellectual doesn't entail the writers being arrogant, but rather their role. Charla, apart from being a writer, you're also a journalist and chief culture writer at The Guardian. You're now working in the Ukraine. First I was surprised, wondering what a culture journalist is doing in Ukraine. I would like to ask, from the perspective of the press, or from a journalistic perspective, how can the events occurring now be shared? I'm afraid we'll wrap up with this final question, and we won't have time for questions from the audience, but I've looked for ways to, in a way, interpret the questions that you expressed earlier on.
Thank you. And in a way, I can draw together a couple of threads that we've been discussing between us, because in fact, this morning, The Guardian published an opinion piece by me, which was kind of complaining about the failure of government to really understand the power of culture in our society, and how this, this is so important, but it somehow remains very difficult for politicians to sort of understand how important it is to make the space for that as a matter of social justice, in my opinion. I think art will always be made, but under any circumstances. But actually, it's a question of social justice for governments, for authorities to make the space for everyone to be able to make art. So in terms of Ukraine, the reason I went to Ukraine to report on the war as a culture writer, well, the short way of putting this is that I became very, very interested in art as a means of documentation. And I think this does connect with what you've been talking about, Cristina, in relation to the archive. The artists provide a form of documentation which is very, very different from what we've just been discussing, the kind of opinion piece or even the piece of reportage. What I've discovered over nearly 3 years of reporting in Ukraine, and this came to me quite slowly, actually, exactly what it was that I sort of concluded artists were doing. Artists were finding ways to document things that were too difficult and too tender and too hard to discuss in reportage, or certainly from the official perspectives. As we know, I'm sure everyone in this room knows that in a war and conflict situation, things become very, very black and white. And what I've discovered that artists have done in Ukraine is document emotion, actually. In the end, I think the most important thing that artists have done in Ukraine is document emotion. And the means for doing that are very often poetry, because poetry is the one form that really can deal with the explosion of time and the explosion of language that happens in a conflict situation when, your ordinary life suddenly stops. Your past seems irrelevant and your future just cannot happen. And you exist in this strange, fragmented present where everything that you understood about time and history has fallen away. And so it's actually poetry that can in the way that the novel can't actually. I mean, the novels about this war will be written in good time, but not now, I think, because I think the novel has to have some kind of understanding of time in its bones and its structure, whereas poetry can deal with the explosion of time. So, and I think I've seen visual artists who have dealt with and conveyed all sorts of things that I, as a journalist, would struggle to do in my kind of documentation. That is feelings of guilt and shame. One thing that's very noticeable about Ukrainian society now is that people's experience, and maybe this would ring bells for, your society in Colombia, which has also, of course, been affected in recent history by conflict, that people's experience of conflicts are very, very different in different parts of society. Some people have fought. Some people have lost people. Some people are in exile. These experiences actually draw people very far away from each other. It's extremely difficult to talk about. A poet I know, Irina Tsilik, Ukrainian poet, has just written a collection called Thin Ice, because that is the experience of trying to come close to people. And it's very difficult to come close to people when your experience of this kind of appalling situation has been so different. So it took me time to answer. There are many, many things that I've been thinking about in my reporting in Ukraine. I've been thinking, because the war in a sense is a war about culture, it's a war about history and identity, and whether, as it were, you know, it's about the existence of Ukraine as an entity, as a place with its distinct history and language and culture. So culture is absolutely the thing that's being thought about, aside from territory and aside from prestige and aside from all the other things that are motivating the invasion of Ukraine. But it has culture very centrally as part of that. So part of what I've been thinking about, again, a familiar topic to many of us, is it's a war of decolonization. It's a war of taking back agency over one's own history and identity, and taking back one's own agency over one's language. So all of that I've found, I have to say, extremely moving, very difficult at times. But the one thing that it's absolutely certainly done is to reinforce something that, of course, I've always believed as a culture journalist, but now more than ever, which is that culture and making art and self-expression is absolutely central to human existence, and that it's not something that we just do when we have completed the other tasks of feeding ourselves and housing ourselves. It's something that comes up through every crack. I think you were talking about things coming through the cracks, Cristina, in terms of expression and expression that goes against the sort of official version of events, and that so it's absolutely there. It's absolutely there, as central as eating and sleeping and protecting yourself from the elements. And that's how I'll end. Thank you.
Para cerrar,
to wrap up, Garcia Marquez, at the end of that interview with Vargas Llosa, said, "The truth is that the only commitment a writer has is to write well." And I believe he's right. But I would like to add that the commitment for those of us reading writers is to, in a way, being vampires to extract from the core of everything that they have said. So thank you very much.